She changed her Wi-Fi password and her neighbor called 911 on her. Minutes later, the cops were at her door. What they uncovered next was something far more disturbing. Tamara had always wanted a quiet place to call home. After years of city chaos, she finally found it. A suburban house in a peaceful neighborhood in Overland Park, Kansas. It wasn't flashy, but it was hers. A fresh start. She spent the first few days unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting familiar with her surroundings. The neighbors seemed friendly enough. Most waved when they saw her. Most, except for Linda Patterson, the woman from 3 houses down. Tamara noticed her almost immediately. Late 50s, short blonde bob, the type who always seemed to be watching. The first interaction wasn't exactly warm. Tamara had been bringing in groceries when Linda walked by, her small terrier tugging at its leash. "You new here?" Linda asked, scanning Tamara up and down. "Yeah, just moved in," Tamara replied, setting her bags down. Linda didn't smile. "Hope you like it here." It's a close-knit neighborhood. Something about the way she said it. Like a warning, not a welcome, stuck with Tamara. But she brushed it off. Maybe Linda was just protective of her space. For the most part, things were fine. She worked remotely, and her job as an IT consultant meant long hours in front of a screen. Having strong Wi-Fi was non-negotiable, so she set up her router, secured the network, and got back to business. A week passed, and that's when she started noticing it. The internet felt slower. At first, she chalked it up to the service provider. But it kept happening. Random disconnects, buffering during video calls. It didn't make sense. One evening, after an especially frustrating drop in connection, she decided to check her router settings. She wasn't expecting anything unusual, but then, there it was. An unknown device connected to her network. She frowned, clicking into the details. The device had been active for weeks. That's when a chill ran through her. This wasn't just a neighbor accidentally latching onto her Wi-Fi. Someone had been using her internet without permission, for a while. Tamara tightened her jaw. Not on her watch. She changed the password immediately, making sure to lock everything down with an even stronger encryption. It should have ended there. But 15 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights appeared in her driveway. Something told her this was about to take a turn she never expected. Tamara barely had time to process the flashing lights before there was a firm knock on the door. She exhaled sharply, setting her laptop aside, and made her way to the front. When she opened it, 2 uniformed officers stood on her porch. Their faces were unreadable, but their presence alone sent a wave of irritation through her. "Ma'am, we received a report about suspicious cyber activity coming from this residence," the taller officer said. Tamara frowned. "Excuse me?" The second officer, a stockier man with a notepad, glanced down at his notes. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, called 911. Said someone in this house was trying to hack into private networks." Tamara's lips parted in disbelief. Linda. She glanced past the officers and sure enough, there she was, standing on her porch, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, watching. Tamara folded her arms. "Let me get this straight. I changed my own Wi-Fi password. And my neighbor called the cops." The taller officer shifted uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am, she claims she got a notification that her network was being compromised right after your password change." Tamara let out a humorless laugh. "That's ridiculous." Linda stepped forward, inserting herself into the conversation. "I knew something was off the second my Wi-Fi went down," she said, voice sharp with accusation. "Tamara," she spat her name like it was venomous, "has been doing something suspicious. It's not normal." Tamara's hands clenched into fists. What was this woman even talking about? "I work in IT," she snapped. "I changed my password because someone was connected to my network without permission." Linda let out a scoff. "Oh, please. I have security alerts. I know what I saw." The second officer cut in before Tamara could fire back. "Look, we just need to confirm there's no illegal activity. Do you mind showing us your network settings?" Tamara could feel the rage bubbling in her chest. This entire situation was absurd. But she knew how this worked. Refusing would only escalate things. She stepped aside. "Fine. Come in." The officers followed her to the living room where she pulled up her router's settings. See? She said, pointing to the unfamiliar device still listed on her network. That's not mine. That's why I changed my password. The taller officer leaned in, eyes scanning the screen. Something shifted in his expression. You're saying someone else was using your Wi-Fi? Tamara's patience snapped. Yes, that's what I've been trying to tell you. Linda let out a dramatic huff. Oh, come on. She's just saying that now because she got caught. The officers exchanged a look, one that made it clear they weren't buying Linda's hysteria. The stockier officer turned back to Tamara. Do you have any way of knowing where that connection was coming from? Tamara's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. Oh, I do. And what she was about to find would change everything. Tamara didn't bother looking at Linda anymore. She was done entertaining her theatrics. Instead, she focused on the officers, fingers already moving across her keyboard as she pulled up more detailed network logs. You see this? She pointed at her screen, highlighting the suspicious device's IP address. Every internet-connected device leaves a trace. And this one? It's been connected for weeks. The taller officer squinted at the screen. And you can pinpoint where it's coming from? Tamara nodded. Give me a second. She launched a tool to track the approximate location of the IP. The results loaded in seconds. Her stomach tightened as the numbers settled on an address. She turned the laptop around, letting the officers read it for themselves. It was coming from Linda's house. Silence. Tamara could feel the shift in the room. The officers stiffened, their neutral expressions replaced by something closer to realization. Linda's face, however, went from smug to frozen. That's not possible, Linda blurted out, shaking her head. That's a mistake. Tamara tilted her head slightly. You sure? Because it looks like you were the one stealing my internet. And not just that. Someone from your house has been accessing private information. Emails, data transfers, even my security cameras. The officer's eyes snapped back to Linda. That true, ma'am? The stockier officer asked. Linda's face was turning red. I don't know anything about that. Maybe someone hacked me. Tamara let out a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Then why did you call the police the second I changed my password? Linda's mouth opened, then closed. She had nothing. The taller officer cleared his throat, his stance shifting. Miss Patterson, we're going to need to ask you some questions. Linda took a step back. This is ridiculous. I'm the victim here. You saw the alert on my phone. Tamara almost laughed. Linda, you know how easy it is to set up fake alerts. If you really thought you were being hacked, you'd call your internet provider. But no, you called 911 on me. One of the officers took out his notepad. Ma'am, we'll need access to your router and any devices connected to your network. You might want to cooperate. Linda's defensiveness turned to something else. Panic. Her eyes darted from Tamara to the officers, her breathing quickening. I need to talk to my husband first. The officers exchanged another look. The stockier one spoke up. Let's make it simple. You're either willingly cooperating now, or we come back with a warrant. Tamara watched as Linda's entire demeanor shifted. The confidence, the arrogance. It was gone. What was left was naked fear. She knew she was caught, but Tamara had a feeling this was only the beginning. Linda's hesitation said everything. She knew what was coming. Tamara folded her arms, watching as the officers waited for a response. Seconds stretched. Linda's fingers twitched at her sides, her breathing uneven. Then, she turned on her heel and stormed toward her house. The stockier officer sighed. Guess that answers that. He reached for his radio. We're going to need a unit to secure a warrant. No, wait! Linda spun back around, hands raised, her voice frantic. You don't need to do that. I'll show you my router. I have nothing to hide. Tamara didn't buy the sudden change in tone. Linda wasn't cooperating because she wanted to. She was stalling. Still, the officers followed her down the street, leaving Tamara standing on her porch. This wasn't enough. Her gut told her Linda wasn't working alone. Something bigger was happening here. If someone in that house had been accessing her private data, who's to say they weren't doing worse? Tamara went back inside, locked the door behind her, and sat at her desk. She needed to dig deeper. She pulled up her network logs again, this time looking for patterns. The unauthorized access had started long before she moved in. Months, maybe more. But there was something else. The data transfers weren't just random browsing. They were targeted. Bank logins, work credentials, even her home security camera footage, all had been accessed from Linda's IP. Tamara's chest tightened. Whoever was behind this hadn't just stolen Wi-Fi. They had been watching her. Her pulse picked up. How much had they seen? What were they doing with that information? A cold realization settled in. This wasn't just about Linda. She clicked through more logs, tracing activity spikes. Some of the biggest ones weren't even connected to her. They led to other houses on the block. Tamara sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. Linda, or someone in her house, wasn't just spying on her. They had been collecting data on multiple neighbors. She didn't know why, but she was about to find out. Tamara's mind raced as she clicked through more logs. The data transfers weren't random, they followed a pattern. Every few nights, at almost the same time, someone from Linda's house accessed files connected to different homes in the neighborhood. Emails, camera feeds, even financial information. Tamara swallowed hard. This wasn't just Wi-Fi theft, it was surveillance. Before she could process it, a knock rattled her door. Sharp, urgent. She jumped, then exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. When she opened it, the taller officer stood there, his expression tighter than before. "We need to talk." Tamara stepped aside, letting him in. He glanced around her living room, then back at her. Something's off with Linda's setup. Tamara's stomach clenched. How so? The officer rubbed the back of his neck. For one, she acted confused about her own router, like she didn't know where it was. He shook his head. And two, when we finally found it, it had remote access ports open. Someone else was controlling it. Tamara's fingers twitched. Meaning Linda might not be the one doing this, or at least not alone. Tamara turned back to her laptop. I already suspected that. She showed him her screen, the network activity from other houses. His expression darkened. So it's not just you, he muttered. They've been watching others too. Tamara nodded. And I don't think it's random. The officer took a deep breath. Listen, we're getting a forensic team involved. But off the record, he glanced toward the window, voice lower now. Linda's husband works in cybersecurity. Defense contracts. Government-level access. Tamara's heart skipped. Her mind replayed every odd glance from Linda, every strange look from her husband, every time she felt watched but brushed it off. The officer sighed. Whatever's happening here, it's bigger than a nosy neighbor. And I have a feeling you're not the first person they've done this to. Tamara knew one thing for sure. Linda wasn't just spying. She and her husband were running something deeper, something darker. And now, the question wasn't just whether they'd get caught. It was whether Tamara had already seen too much. The man sprinted down the sidewalk, clutching the laptop like his life depended on it. The officers were right behind him, shouting commands, but he wasn't stopping. Tamara's pulse thundered in her ears as she watched from her window. Then, a screech of tires. A patrol car cut him off at the corner. He tried to pivot, but it was too late. One officer lunged, tackling him hard onto the pavement. Tamara exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her chest. The man struggled, but the officers had him pinned, one securing the laptop, while the other snapped handcuffs around his wrists. Linda stood on her porch, frozen in horror. The officers dragged the man to his feet. "Who is he?" the taller cop demanded, turning to Linda. Her mouth opened, then closed. Tamara stepped onto her porch, watching closely. That's my son," Linda finally muttered, voice barely above a whisper. The stockier officer scoffed. "So you did know something was going on?" Linda shook her head wildly. "No, I mean, yes, but not like this. I thought he was just helping neighbors get better connections." Tamara let out a bitter laugh. "Helping?" The taller officer didn't look amused. "Ma'am, your son has been running an illegal network infiltration from your house. He's been accessing security cameras, emails, and possibly even setting up burglaries." Linda's face drained of color. The officers led her son to the patrol car. As he passed, he turned his head just slightly toward Tamara. A smirk. Her stomach twisted. He wasn't just some kid messing around with tech. He knew exactly what he was doing. Linda sank onto her porch steps, burying her face in her hands. Tamara didn't feel sorry for her. She had called the police on Tamara for protecting her own privacy. And now, she was the one watching her son get arrested. The stockier officer walked back toward Tamara. "We'll need you to submit everything you found as evidence." Tamara nodded. "I already saved all the logs. I'll send them over." The officer tipped his head. "You might have just stopped something bigger than stolen Wi-Fi." Tamara swallowed hard, glancing at the patrol car. She had a feeling he was right. But was this really over? Tamara stood on her porch long after the patrol cars disappeared down the street. The air felt heavier now. Linda had gone inside, slamming her door shut like she could lock away the truth. But the damage was done. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. People were talking. Whispers passed from porch to porch, over fences in driveways. The woman who had always been the first to stick her nose in everyone else's business had been hiding something worse than she ever accused anyone of. Tamara wasn't surprised. She sat at her desk, staring at her laptop. Her router logs were still pulled up, the evidence clear as day. It wasn't just about her. Multiple neighbors had been compromised. She could let it go now. The police had the proof. Linda's son was behind bars. But something told her this wasn't just about one man with a laptop. She clicked into a private security forum, the kind where tech professionals exchanged warnings about cyber threats. She typed up a summary of what happened, leaving out names, but making sure to highlight how easy it was for a neighbor to infiltrate private networks. Within minutes, responses poured in. She wasn't the only one. One reply stood out. "This happens more than people think. It starts small, stealing Wi-Fi, peeking into emails. But once they realize how much they can see, they push further. Some sell the data, some use it for scams, and some, they watch, waiting for the right moment to use what they've found." Tamara exhaled slowly. She thought about how her cameras had been accessed. How long had someone been watching? Had they seen her routines? Not just hers, but the entire neighborhood's. A notification popped up, a message from one of her neighbors. "Thank you for catching this. I checked my own settings. Someone's been on my network too. I never would have known if you hadn't spoken up." Tamara sat back, fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had moved here for peace, a fresh start. But if this had happened to her, it could happen to anyone. She typed a quick reply. "Check your logs, change your passwords, and never assume your neighbor is just being friendly." Before she closed her laptop, she clicked one final setting. A full security lock on her entire network. Just in case. Because in a world where privacy was so easily invaded, you couldn't afford to be careless. How many of us actually check who's connected to our networks? It's easy to assume the biggest threats come from the outside, but sometimes they're closer than we think. Stay aware, protect your data, and if something feels off, don't ignore it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more real-life lessons that'll make you think twice.